The morning air in Miller's Creek usually smelled of damp earth and blooming clover, but today it smelled like expensive perfume and hubris. Arthur Miller, a man whose skin was as weathered as the barn he'd inherited from his grandfather, stood on his porch with a steaming mug of black coffee. He watched as a sleek, silver Bentley Continental GT purred down the gravel lane. It looked like a shark swimming in a koi pond. The car didn't stop at the guest parking, it didn't stop at the curb. Instead, it glided right up the dirt incline, pivoting with surgical precision until it sat broadside across the double sliding doors of Arthur's main tractor barn. The door opened and out stepped Evelyn Vance. To the rest of the neighborhood, she was the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. To Arthur, she was simply the HOA Karen. She wore a beige pantsuit that cost more than Arthur's first 3 trucks combined, and she held a clipboard like a shield. "Arthur," she called out, her voice cutting through the peaceful chirping of the crickets. "We need to talk about your industrial eyesore again." Arthur stepped off his porch, his heavy work boots crunching on the gravel. "Morning, Evelyn, you're blocking the barn. I've got a field to mow and a clutch to check." Evelyn didn't move. She leaned against the driver's side door of her pristine $200,000 machine. "I'm blocking a violation, Arthur. This barn hasn't been painted desert sand or muted pebble as per the new aesthetic guidelines. Until you sign the agreement to comply, I'm not moving. Consider this a physical lien on your property." "Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "That barn has been red since 1945. My grandfather built it. It's not part of your HOA. I never signed your papers when you bought the orchard land next door and turned it into a gated community. The bylaws state that any property adjacent to and visible from the estates must conform to maintain property values," she countered, clicking her pen. "My Bentley is parked on what my surveyor says is an easement. Now, are we going to be reasonable or are we going to be difficult?" The rising tension. Arthur spent the next 3 hours trying to be reasonable. He called the sheriff's office, only to find out they were dealing with a multi-car pileup on the interstate and wouldn't be out for hours. He called the towing company, but they told him they didn't have a flatbed available that could handle a luxury vehicle on a dirt incline without significant liability risk. Every time Arthur looked out the window, he saw Evelyn sitting in her air-conditioned sanctuary, scrolling through her phone, her car blocking the only exit for his 1978 John Deere 4440. He needed that tractor. The weather reports were predicting a massive cell of hailstorms by evening. If he didn't get his late-season hay cut and baled today, the crop would be ruined. That crop was his mortgage payment. It was his winter feed. It was his life. At 1:00 p.m., Arthur walked back out. He was no longer carrying a coffee mug. He was wearing his grease-stained cap and leather gloves. "Last chance, Evelyn," Arthur said, standing by her window. "Move the car. I have work to do and the sky is turning gray. I'm not playing HOA games today." Evelyn rolled down the window just an inch. The cool scent of new car and arrogance wafted out. "The fine is $500 a day, Arthur. When you have the check and the paint swatches ready, I'll move. Otherwise, I'm quite comfortable. I have a hotspot, a latte, and all the time in the world." Arthur looked at the sky. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. He looked at the Bentley, shimmering in the sun, a monument to a woman who thought rules were weapons to be used against people who lived differently than her. "Fine," Arthur whispered, "have it your way." The climax. Arthur didn't go back to the house. He walked around to the side of the barn, entering through the small pedestrian door. The interior was cool and smelled of diesel and old hay. In the shadows sat the beast. It wasn't the John Deere, it was his project, a modified Case IH Steiger 620. It was a 600-horsepower articulated monster with tires that stood 6 feet tall. It was a machine designed to move the earth itself. Arthur climbed the metal ladder into the pressurized cab. He turned the key. The engine didn't just start, it roared, a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated the very foundation of the barn. Outside, Evelyn looked up from her phone. She felt the ground tremble. She looked at the barn doors. They were heavy, reinforced timber. Arthur engaged the hydraulics. The massive front blade, usually used for clearing deep snow and boulders, lowered with a hiss of steam. He shifted the gear into low-range torture. Inside the Bentley, Evelyn's eyes went wide. She saw the barn doors begin to groan. She reached for her ignition, but in her panic, she dropped her phone between the seats. "He wouldn't," she hissed to herself. "He's a farmer, he's terrified of a lawsuit." She was wrong. Arthur wasn't thinking about lawsuits. He was thinking about 30 years of being told his lifestyle was an eyesore. The barn doors burst open. The massive steel blade of the Steiger emerged first like the prow of a ship. It caught the side of the Bentley right above the rear wheel well. The sound was spectacular. It wasn't a crash. It was a slow, agonizing scream of expensive aluminum and carbon fiber being folded like tinfoil. Evelyn screamed, scrambling out of the passenger side door just as the Bentley began to slide sideways. The Steiger didn't even slow down. The massive tires, designed to grip soft mud and pull tons of weight, simply rolled upward. Crunch. The first tire flattened the trunk. Crunch. The second tire, part of the articulated middle, climbed over the roof. The reinforced safety glass of the Bentley exploded into a million diamonds. The pillars snapped. The $5,000 leather seats were pressed into the floorboards until they were no thicker than a pancake. Arthur kept his foot steady on the throttle. He felt a slight bump, like driving over a particularly large log in the woods. He looked out the rearview mirror and saw Evelyn Vance standing in the dirt, her mouth open so wide she could have swallowed a bird. Her clipboard lay forgotten in the mud. Arthur drove the Steiger 30 yards out into the field, then put it in neutral and hopped down. The aftermath. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the tink-tink-tink of the Bentley's cooling engine, or what was left of it. The car was now a silver streak of scrap metal, no higher than a foot off the ground. Evelyn finally found her voice. It was a high-pitched, jagged thing. You, my car, that was a custom order. I'll have you in jail. I'll take this farm. I'll have your life." Arthur pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It wasn't a check. "This is a map of the property lines, Evelyn. My lawyer and a private surveyor finished it last week. You see that red line?" He pointed to the dirt where the car had been. "That's not an easement, that's my private driveway. You were trespassing on a working farm after being warned 3 times to vacate." "You crushed a Bentley," she shrieked, pointing at the pancake of metal. "I cleared an obstruction," Arthur corrected mildly. "I told you I had to get to work. The law is funny about attractive nuisances and interference with agricultural commerce. You blocked my livelihood, I removed the blockage." Just then, the sheriff's cruiser pulled up the lane, blue and red lights flashing against the darkening sky. Sheriff Miller, no relation though they'd gone to school together, stepped out and adjusted his belt. He looked at the Steiger. He looked at the flat silver remains of the luxury car. He looked at Evelyn. "Sheriff, arrest him," Evelyn cried, lunging toward him. "He's a maniac. He intentionally destroyed my vehicle." The sheriff walked around the remains of the car. He poked a flattened tire with his boot. "Well now, Evelyn, looks like you parked in the way of a 60,000-pound piece of farm equipment on private property." "It's an HOA violation," she yelled. "HOA don't mean much to a Steiger," the sheriff said, suppressing a grin. "Arthur, did you see her car there?" "Sun was in my eyes, Sheriff, and these big rigs have a lot of blind spots. I told her I was coming out. I reckon she just didn't believe me." The sheriff turned to Evelyn. "I can write a report for your insurance, but honestly, you're lucky I don't cite you for obstructing a farm operation. There's a right to farm law in this county, Evelyn. It means if you get in the way of a man's tractor on his own land, you're the one in the wrong." The resolution. The hailstorm broke 20 minutes later. Huge, icy stones pelted the ground, but Arthur's hay was already safe. He'd spent the afternoon working with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. Evelyn had been forced to call a taxi. The closest one was 40 miles away. She stood under the eaves of Arthur's porch, shivering in her ruined beige suit while he ignored her and finished his chores. A week later, a flatbed tow truck finally hauled the Bentley pancake away. The story had spread through Miller's Creek like wildfire. The HOA's aesthetic committee suddenly lost its appetite for harassing the local farmers. In fact, 3 of the neighbors resigned from the board the next day, citing a desire to live in peace. Arthur sat on his porch that evening, the air cool and crisp after the storm. His barn was still red. It would always be red. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the spot in the dirt where the silver paint had left a shimmering scar on the earth. He'd eventually rake it over and plant some grass, but for now, he liked the reminder. People like Evelyn Vance thought the world was made of clipboards, fines, and expensive toys. They thought they could park their privilege in front of a man's door and expect him to bow. But they forgot that some doors are meant to stay open, and some men are built of the same iron as their machines. Arthur smiled as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long, red shadow from his barn across the fields. He had a lot of work to do tomorrow, and for the first time in a long time, nothing was standing in his way.